Here, today we're working with CSS selectors, and there are 3 levels of selectors that are the most common. Now, I've got Visual Studio Code open here on the left, and I have a blank style.css file that is linked to our HTML file, and the HTML file is open in Chrome already. I'm using the live server extension with Visual Studio Code, so we will instantly see our changes in our page. The structure of the HTML page has an H1 heading, and after that we have 3 articles. Each article has its own H2 heading and paragraph inside. So as we talk about the 3 different types of basic selectors in CSS, let's start with the most common. There is only one body, more properties for each of the declarations as we go through tutorials, but I'm going to use a few today just for examples. And I'm going to set the font size to 22 pixels and save. Now we can see this made all of our text on our page larger, and this is due to inheritance. So these other elements actually inherited from the body element, and we'll get more into inheritance in just a little bit too. But this in itself is an element selector. Now, there's only one body element per page, but say I went ahead and selected the paragraph using the paragraph selector, and now I can set the color of the text, and I'm going to set the color of the text to purple, and I'll save. And notice it changed all 3 of our paragraphs to purple. So element selectors select all of the elements of that type. So just specifying P for the paragraph element selects all paragraph elements. And now the second type of selector is a class. And so let's define a class selector, and I'm going to call this class gray. Use the name to read. Makes sense to me. 3, set equal to gray your project or throughout your page. Use this again in the future. Change our background color to an interesting color name. I like Papaya Whip, so I'll save, and that's much easier. This is, we typically wouldn't set a font size in here because we want that. Let's move on to the CSS box model. Today you'll learn that everything in CSS is a box, but before we finish, I'll show you how to turn a box into a so it read this last. Essentially, this is the last rule, and that means whichever definition it reads at the last will be applied. Now, specificity can override this, and that's where we talked about elements and then classes. Classes are more specific, for example, than just an element selector. So we have our class here that has the color gray, and it is overriding the red. Now, if we remove this class and we save, now they're all red. But even though we're looking at the cascade and starting from the top down, even if I put this class above the paragraph selectors and save, it still applies to these last 2 paragraphs because it has more specificity than an element selector. And the element selector here, purple, of course, is overridden with the last rule being the element selector here for red. So we start out with a red paragraph, and it's really applied to all paragraphs except that then CSS sees there is a gray class applied to the second and third paragraphs, and that has more specificity, so it overrules whatever is set by the element selector. Now, a problem you can have is when you have a large CSS file and maybe you have set this gray class on these paragraphs, and later on, let's say you're way down a couple of hundred lines and you're setting a color on a paragraph and you can't understand why it's not being applied. So let's go ahead and expand Chrome here, and you can right click and choose Inspect. And once you inspect your page, then you can look at the different classes and CSS rules that are applied. So here's a good example of that. We have got our third paragraph highlighted up here in the Elements tab, and then we're looking at the styles, and we can see we've got paragraph rules here, these element selectors, but color purple is crossed out, and then color red is crossed out. So CSS knows these rule sets exist for paragraph, but it also knows it should follow what is the most specific using the rules of specificity. So here we have a color gray that is being applied. So you can see sometimes when you're struggling with your CSS and you have written a rule and you're not understanding why it is not being applied, you should inspect your code with DevTools. And once again, you right click and choose Inspect to do that. And then just go to the correct tabs, Elements, highlight the element that you want, look at the styles, and you'll see how it is being read by CSS in the browser, or how the browser is reading your CSS, and then see how those rule sets are being applied, which ones are being overridden and which ones are actually being applied. Okay, I'm going to close that out now and I'll resize Chrome. So I'll come back over here to our style, and as we go to the top, let's talk about inheritance, as I got into specificity a little bit already. But inheritance, that is where another element inherits the settings from, or the properties from, its parent element. So the body element is parent to every other element here. And so when we set the font size, all of these other elements inherited that font size. Now, typically anything related to font or typography is inherited, and that can include things like color, line height, alignment, all sorts of settings dealing with the font and the typography. However, any properties that are not related to those things are not inherited. And I know that'll just take a little bit of getting used to as you learn more about CSS. So for example, this font size was inherited, but another setting we could put is a border, and I'll put 3 pixels so it's easy to see, solid black. And I'll save this. Now notice the border only went around the body element. It didn't apply to all the other elements inside of the body. So that's an example of something that is not inherited. Now I'll go ahead and remove that again. Now we did briefly talk about that universal selector. Let me go back to that and show you that this is not inheritance. This is actually selecting all elements. So here, if I said a border, and I'll put 1 pixel solid red, and save, notice it does apply to all elements. That's because we selected all the elements here. So setting something here with the universal selector is not going to cause inheritance really, because it's actually selecting all the elements itself. Okay, I'll remove the universal selector again, but getting back to just the inheritance overall, this can be very handy because it keeps us from writing repeated code. In other words, it keeps our code dry, which is an acronym that stands for don't repeat yourself. So we want to write less code and be more efficient, and inheritance helps us do that. Now, some things are not inherited. Like I mentioned, the border would be one of those. Also, form elements do not inherit, say, the font size and other typography settings. So it wouldn't be that unusual to see something like this that would take a button and, let's say, an input, a text area, and let me see if I'm leaving anything else out, maybe a select, anything like that, and we might see then font and set it to inherit. And that would go ahead and make those elements inherit the font settings, because just a mental note that form elements do not typically inherit those font settings. But now, to take advantage of inheritance and write dry code, we can use the body element, which appears only once per page, or we could use the HTML element, and either would work. Oftentimes, if you're just starting out and just remembering, it might be best to just use the body. Oftentimes I use the HTML element because, once again, the inheritance applies there, so we can save here without, see the difference. Now I'll go ahead and apply it in HTML, and once again we have the larger font, because there are, for me at least, some specific settings for the body, and I like to see those separate. So I often put all of my font settings in the HTML selector, but again, either would work. One other element selector that I do use at times is the main element. It is a semantic element and it should appear only once per page, but then you have to be aware that you're only selecting the things inside of the main element. So if we look at our page, I've got the H1 inside of a header element and not inside of the main element. So if I were to change the font family inside of our main selector and I change this to monospace, which is easy to see the change with, go ahead and save, you can see all of the articles switch to monospace, but our H1 heading is still using the other font. Okay, coming back to specificity, just something we talked about, so a quick review. The element selector is the least specific, and then a class selector is more specific, and then although we don't want to use them in our CSS, an ID selector is even more specific than that. Sometimes something's not working out and you're wanting to figure out why it's not working out, or you just can't figure it out and you get frustrated. I'm going to show you something that will work, but I'm going to recommend that you do not use it. It's kind of the nuclear option, if you will, and it's to put an exclamation mark and put important. Now see how red should be applied to this first paragraph, but with the important flag right here after our purple, the first paragraph purple. Notice what else happened. It also another. Today we're learning about CSS colors. I've got Visual Studio Code here on the left and our web page on the right. It is a basic web page and I'm using the live font size. I've declared the font family. Have now disappeared. However, we could put it at 50 and overall for web pages. Let's move on to CSS units. Units determine the size of everything in your page. Today we're going to cover the most common CSS. Change at all. I can refresh and it won't make any difference. It did not change our font size with the user settings, and that's because we took that choice away when we said no, these absolutely must be 16 pixels here. That's our root size. But if I delete this and we just let the browser handle the default size, instantly all of our font gets bigger and our user settings take over. We don't want to take that choice away from the users, so we don't want to use an absolute font size such as a pixel setting. So I'll go ahead and delete that. So where would we want to use pixels, an absolute value? There are other settings that we might want an absolute value for. So I'll select the H1 that I have here and I'm going to set a border on it and I'll set it to 2 pixels. And then just so we can see it better, I'll set it to dashed and red so it really stands out, and save. And now we can see this border around our H1 element, and we have this absolute value for the pixel width. And no matter what happens to the page, on a small viewport, large viewport, whether it's a mobile device or a large desktop screen, this will remain as 2 pixels, and that's okay in this instance. Let's go back to our MDN page. And now that we've covered the only pixel size that we were going to cover, and that was down here on our pixel chart, we're going to now cover percentage. And we see that up here in a different chart. This is a numbers, links, and percentages chart here. So we're going to use percentage, and it says it represents a fraction of some other value. So 50% of something else. Percentages are always relative to another quantity. So that's a consideration as well. Now, when we set percentages, we wouldn't normally do that with a font size either. So let's set a percentage for a width on our H1. And now by default, an H1 is a block level element. And so by default, it has a width of 100%. So if we do that, we're not really changing anything. And now it's just 100% as expected. So let's go ahead and change that. It looks at the parent though. It's taking up 100% of the parent's width, or whatever was given to it. So whatever it has available to it, it took up 100%. And now this is only taking up 50%. So let's look at the parent for the H1. It is inside of a header element. So if we take this header element and we set it to a width of 50%, then we should see a difference. And yes, it's even smaller. So we're taking up, see at this when we look at paragraphs instead. So it's one root, the EM, or one root M, but that means the root size that is defined, and in our case, when we don't set it, then it's set by the browser. So hopefully that clears up some confusion. But if we put in 2ems, then it's going to double the default size, and now we're probably at 36 pixels right here because most browsers default to that 16 pixel size. So you can see how to 2rem also the parent going to look at save. Well, now this or something like margin or box size for the H1, and let's make it bigger. Let's make it 3rem here, and we save. We instantly have a bigger font size on the H1, but now I could set the padding to 1em, which is the equivalent of the font size of that element. So now this would also be 3rem, so it should be a pretty good size padding. Yes, we have a lot of padding, so I probably don't want that much. Maybe I want to drop it to 0.5, and now that's more reasonable. That looks pretty good for a heading there. So we added that padding, which is inside this border. It added extra padding, and that is essentially half of 3rems, which would be 1.5. And if we relate all this back to would be fixed in of 0, and that helps us determine the character width. And that kind of comes from print, magazine, newspaper layout, and those sort of things where you only want to have a certain width based on the character size. So in this example, we have a font size here for our paragraph. I'm going to go ahead and set the width of the paragraph, and let's say we don't want any more than an estimated 40 characters per line before the line wraps in the paragraph. If we set that width, notice it now has approximately 40 characters before the line wraps, and that kind of helps us define columns if we're doing that in some type of layout. Now, we've acknowledged that the browser sets a default font size, but it actually sets a lot of different default styles as well. So let's go ahead and right-click on this H1 heading and choose Inspect, or you could press Control, Shift, and the letter I. Either way, what we're doing is opening up the DevTools. It may scrunch our page here a little bit, but that's okay. If I highlight this H1, now it is showing several things about the page. It's showing that there's a large margin. That's going to be the orange when I highlight over. It's showing the green area, and that's padding that we set. And then the blue area is the H1 itself right here. So we see all of those things in DevTools when we hover over these elements. And by the way, I'm on the Elements tab of DevTools. And then if you don't have your DevTools on the right, you can click the 3 dots here, and there's a dockside setting. Maybe it's on the bottom for you, but if you want it on the right, you can choose dock to the right just like I have here. So we can really see more about all of these elements in DevTools. What we can also see as we come down here are the styles, and then we see the H1 and the styles that I have set on the H1 element. But underneath that, we see some others as well, and it says User Agent Style Sheet. This is what the browser is setting on the H1 element by default, that we don't have to. And you can see we have put in a different font size, so we have overridden the font size for the H1 element, so it has crossed that out. Everything else here, the display block and the different margins and even the font weight, are applied from that user style sheet. So those are default styles, and we can override them just like I did with the font size. And before we get into these next 2 relative units, we are going to override some of these. So what I want to do is start a CSS reset, which I'll talk about more in the tutorial of the CSS box model as well. But I'm going to use the selector that selects all elements again, our wildcard selector. And here I'm going to set the margin to 0, the padding to 0, and one other setting that says box sizing, and I'm going to set that to border box. And when I save, notice all the padding and margin is gone. Now our H1 is right up in the left corner. We don't have any space between the paragraph and the H1. We got rid of all of those default margins and paddings that were creating that extra space. But that's important when we go back to that. Let's move on to the CSS box model. Today you'll learn that everything in CSS is a box, but before we finish, I'll show you how to turn a box into a circle if you want to. So let's get started. On the left I have Visual Studio Code, and I have the code from the last tutorial. We'll modify that in just a second. On the right I have a basic web page, once again with an H1 header and a paragraph, and I'm using the live server extension, so any changes I make in the CSS and when I save the file will immediately show then in the web page. Okay, so everything we have over here except the H1 has got to go. So I'm going to delete everything above and below and leave the styles for the H1, and we can now save and we see those changes. So our paragraph text has gotten smaller and everything else is pretty much the same, except we do now have the default styles from the browser again, and we'll get back to that CSS reset in just a bit. But right now we want to look at this box model, and we've already drawn a box by putting a border around our H1 element. We can see this border here defined with shorthand, and we'll get into what all of that means in just a second too. But what I want to do first is drag our Visual Studio Code over as far as I possibly can and give us some more room in the browser because we're going to open up DevTools. So once we do that, you can press Shift Alt, or I'm sorry, not Shift Alt, it is Control Shift, I believe, and the letter I to open DevTools. And if that's not working, then you should be able to, no, that is going to work. It just took a second here on my computer. And if that doesn't work, you could right click and choose Inspect as well. Once you have it open, you may not have your DevTools on the right, and if you don't, you can click the three dots and choose where it is docked. I like to have mine on the right. And then you can select any of the elements in the HTML here, and you see it flashing over on the web page because it highlights what element you've selected. And I am in the Elements tab that you can choose as well. After that, I am going to select that H1. So it's inside of our header element here. And after I select it, I've got H1, and notice the colors changed on the web page. This is already showing us the box model right here. So what we have for the orange is the margin. And then we can clearly see our border that we put in with 2 pixels, and it is dashed. And then inside of that we see green, and that is the padding. And then inside of that we see blue, and that's actually the content. And now if we go down here where we have a Styles tab, let's choose the Computed tab, and we actually see the box model inside of our DevTools. So we can highlight any aspect of this. So I'll go to the content first. And now we only see the blue highlighted on the web page, and that is our content, and it's showing us the actual size of the content in pixels here as well. And then we go to padding, which is the next layer. The padding is once again inside of the border, and it just wraps around our content. It gives some extra space inside of the border, gives our content a little room to breathe, if you will. So here you can see it's 24 pixels. Then we have our border, which it shows it as 1.993 pixels. We set it to 2 pixels. Hey, close enough, right? And after the border, we have margin. And you can see we didn't set a margin. So this margin is just showing the space that is left after our element is there. So on top, we have 32 pixels. And then we have 32 pixels on the bottom as well. And that's probably just because of the default of the H1. We didn't set a margin on the right, but we do see a big margin over there. And that's just because we have set that 50% width on our H1, so it's not taking up the full page space, and what's left is occupied by margin. So it's important that you remember how to get here in DevTools. We're on this Computed tab below, and you always want to be able to bring up the box model to see exactly what's going on with your elements. After that, it's also important to just memorize the different layers of the CSS box model. So starting on the inside, we have content, then we have padding, then we have border, and finally we have margin on the outside. So it's actually 32.16 pixels. And we didn't set that, so that's a default style on the H1. The margin is on the outside of our CSS boxes that we create, whichever elements that we're styling. So the margin is not included in that calculation. However, the rest is. So the border and the padding and the content all add up to that 400 pixels that I set right here. Okay, now that we've broken down how the border box setting works and looked at the CSS box model, let's go ahead and close DevTools and let's just style our page a little bit with some of these properties. I'm going to resize the page a little bit so we have some more room for Visual Studio Code over here on the left. I'll pull this over. There we go. And now let's make some changes. So one thing I have thought about is our H1 right here has some settings I normally probably wouldn't put on an H1. I'm just more concerned with the font there, but the font size that would be assigned by default is okay too. So I'm going to get rid of that. And now these other settings, I would actually be more likely to put on the container than I would on the H1 itself. And the H1 is inside of a header element. So let's go ahead and save that. And it changed just a little bit, but that's okay. I'm going to change these EMs back to rems because now I'm not setting a font size on the header. So I'm going to use 1.5 rem here and save. And now we've got our padding back to about where it was. But now what if I wanted to assign these same settings to the container that our paragraph is in? And that's in the main element. So maybe I don't want this on the header. Maybe I want to assign a container class so I can provide these same settings for more than one container. So I'm going to quickly go over to the HTML. And in the HTML, we'll set a class called container on each of these elements. So we have the header element, and we'll set the class equal to container. And I've got one extra quote there. There we go. And now I'm just going to copy this and I'll paste it into our main element as well. And save that. And there we go. So now we've got dashes around both of these boxes here. Let's go back to the CSS and make these bigger so we can see them better on the page. Right now I'm going to get rid of this 100 pixel or 400 pixel width. Let's go ahead and let them take up the full 100% for now. Okay, let's go ahead and add a font size to the container, and it will apply to both of these differently, but we'll set it to 1.5 rem and save. Now our font's a little bit bigger, but notice how the edges of the border are right up against the page. So on the outside of our box, we can set a margin and also set that to 1.5 rem and save. And now we have our two boxes and the margin has pushed them away from the edge. The margin has also provided space between the two boxes here. And now that we have a font size on our container, we could go ahead and switch this back to EMs. And remember, one EM would be the same as the font size. So it would be equal to the 1.5 rem. So if we make this change, we just change it to 1M and our sizing should stay the same, and it does. If we change this to 1.5, it will get bigger. Yes, and now we have more padding. We could add more margin by doing the same if we want to, so let's go ahead and do that. And now let's go ahead and experiment with the margin and the padding because we don't have to have the same setting on the top, right, bottom, and left. And I did say that order specifically for a reason, because for the margin, we could just say margin top. And here, let's go ahead and say 1.5 EM and save. And look what happens to our other margins. The left and right margins are gone, and you can't really see that we lost the margin on the bottom, but we did. The only thing separating these containers now is the margin on the top. So now let's go ahead and add some margin on the right. And here we'll set this to 2 EM and save, so it's just a little bigger. And now we do have margin on the right, but still no margin on the bottom and no margin on the left. I'm going to press Shift Alt and the down arrow. And now instead of the right, I'm going to switch this one to bottom and save. And now we have some more margin here on the bottom. So the separation between these two boxes got bigger. That's the only thing you could really see right there. And now on the right, let's go ahead and switch, on the left, let's go ahead and switch this to 2 EMs as well. And you can see we got the same thing as if we just said margin 2 EM, except we wanted a margin on top of 1.5 EM. So there is shorthand for this. So I'm going to comment all 4 of these out. And I'll press Shift, Alt, and the letter A to do that. There you can see a CSS comment, so it commented those out. So right now there will be no margin once again. Now the boxes are next to each other, no margin on the left and right. But our shorthand is just saying margin. And when I say this, 1.5 EM, that applies it to top, bottom, left, and right. And it actually goes in the order top, right, bottom, left. So now we could put in different settings with this shorthand if we wanted to. So 1.5 on top, and then 2 M's on the right and the left, and then 2 M's on the bottom. And I can save. And that is the same thing as when we had all 4 of these right here. Now, if I just wanted to have 1.5 on the top and the bottom and 2 on the left and the right, I could delete this third setting right here, and that's what we get. So now it will take 1.5 and apply it to the top and the bottom, and 2 and apply it to the right and the left. However, you can provide all 4 settings. So we could go 3 and 4, and then we would have the shorthand. Notice the left margin, the final value here, is much larger, twice as large actually as the right margin, and then the bottom is definitely larger than the top margin, because here you can see only the top margin as it applies to the first container, and now you can see the top margin and the bottom margin here combined to create the space between the 2 boxes. Now this same idea for shorthand also applies to padding. So I will copy these, actually cut them, and just go back to the 1 setting for margins. So that looks a little bit more normal again. But now let's apply the same thing to the padding and we'll see how that changes. So now we have a much larger left padding of 4, twice as much. I'm going to keep it in the side of the main elements, so I'll just type div, and then I want to give this div a class and set this inheritance. Font and text settings are units just with bolder, and that head element of our HTML. Written that what has followed has been visited and hover, and really we don't have content. So let's note the default styles of these links. They're underlined. That's the first thing to note. Also, if the link has not been visited, it's a blue color. But notice the hypertext link that we have here, and it is purple. So we know this is a visited link, and we can tell all of this just by looking at the page. Also, when we point at a link, it changes our cursor from this arrow to a pointer. It's a little hand pointing its finger at the link. So that is called a pointer cursor. And then there's another default style that we can't even see yet, and that is when we click on a link. So I'm going to click and hold down on this link and it turns red. So this is when the link is active, and that is another default style that is set. So I'm going to go ahead and let go, and it goes back to purple without visiting the link. And if we did visit the link and come back, it would still be purple as visited. So now that we know the default styles, let's look at how those are set. The first one being text decoration that we would set, and that is what controls the underline. So the default would be underline, and if we save, we shouldn't see any difference. But oftentimes developers want to take away that underline and style something different. You do want to make sure that it still indicates somehow that these are links. You want them to stand out in some way, and an underline is a good way for that to happen. But if you want to take that away, you can, but you have to do something else to make the link stand out. Okay, we also mentioned the cursor, so we can set a cursor. But really, cursors have semantic values, and I'll see what Visual Studio Code pulls up. There's lots of different choices here, but let's look, for example, at a not allowed cursor, and it has a semantic value. It tells us something just when we see it. So when I point at JavaScript, you can see we get the little icon that says this is not allowed, and we know what that means. So really, we don't want to change that from a pointer most of the time. There is not really a reason to do that. So let's keep that as pointer, but I'll leave that here so you know the cursor can be set to different values. And of course, the starting color before the link has been clicked is just set by color. And here we see blue is the default color. And I believe that is the actual default color and not some variant of blue. Let me save again and see if I see a difference. And no, it really looks the same to me, but it may look different to you. But once I set this to blue, notice what happens to the visited link. It's changed because it overwrote the default value, and then we haven't set anything for the visited link. So we need to learn how to do that as well. So what I'm about to show you is called a pseudo class. So we'll once again select the anchor element, but now we put a colon, and now I can put a definition after here that defines which pseudo class that I want to select. And right now I want to select the visited pseudo class. And pseudo classes represent the current state of the element, because a state of an anchor element can change. It has either been visited or it hasn't, and there are some others that we'll cover as well. So for visited, let's go ahead and put this back to the default and save. And now you can see our hypertext link is once again purple. Now our other links haven't been visited, so they're still blue. Now let's look at another pseudo class that we can define. And this pseudo class is called hover. When we hover over the link, it doesn't have a default value. Right now, if we hover over a link, it doesn't change at all, either the visited or the not visited link. Both of them still just stay the same. So let's go ahead and change this. And for now, let's just choose a different blue. And I'm going to show you a trick or two where you can choose something kind of in the same range of the color you have selected for your link. But first, let's just choose a blue randomly here. So now when we hover, notice JavaScript is changing colors when I hover over it. And even the visited hypertext links will change color as well, because now when we hover over the link, we have changed that state. It's now in the hover state, and it is changing the color of the link. And then remember, we still have the active state as well. But right now, that's not working either, because that was a default style and we have overwritten that. What has followed has been visited and hover, and really we don't have the default style applied anymore. So let's go ahead and put in that active link, and we can change it to something like what it was. I think it was red, so that will definitely stand out. Select that, and now when I click hypertext link, it definitely turns red. And I think I visited the link, and now we're searching for hypertext links. So I'll go back to our page, and we can see that this link was visited. But if I click and hold down, we can see that it's active, and now I'll just pull away and not visit the link. Now we have to consider specificity, and we also have to consider the order these are in for the cascade. So if we put visited above our anchor selector, visited will still be applied here, even though the anchor selector comes afterwards in the cascade. And that's because this visited pseudo class has more specificity than just an element, just the anchor element. And we can see that if we go to the specificity calculator, and I have this linked to in the resources. And now if I just put in an anchor element, you can see the score is just 001. But if I put in an anchor element with a visited or any other pseudo selector, now the pseudo selector here is a class. I said pseudo selector, a pseudo class. I'm selecting the pseudo class. Classes, attributes, and pseudo classes. So this has more specificity, and that's why the visited link continues to stay purple, even though the anchor element comes afterwards in the cascade. But that's not usually the order we want things. We usually kind of want to think about it in the order that we would have them. So I'm going to put that visited back. But now visited, hover, and active all have the same specificity, and one can overwrite the other. So we really have to think about the order we put those in. Let me save this, and right now they're all working because this is the proper order. Have your anchor tag, and then have your visited pseudo class, your hover pseudo class, and finally your active, and they should all work. So when we hover, it works. Visited, of course, is working, and if I click active, it is working. However, if I rearrange these, they may not. So let me go ahead and take hover and put it above visited and hovered over. Let's move on to styling lists with CSS. Ordered with the H2 title, the to two rems in the bodies. with to pull Visual Studio this page. Bullet points a little bit better. Functions, type. And here we get a list from VS Code, and we can choose different things to appear to the left where we see the numbers. So for example, let's choose lower alpha, and I'll save, and now we can see we have lower alphabet letters here, so ABC. Otherwise, we could choose some other things that I don't even recognize they have in here, like, let's get this reference again. Let's look at, Georgian, and maybe somebody else would understand these symbols. I certainly don't, but here we see symbols to the left that represent whatever Georgian is. Usually the default here is decimal. And so if I save that, we're back to our numbers. That's the default value. You could also see, I believe it said decimal leading 0. There we go. So if we chose that, we would get a 0 in front of each of the numbers. So you've got lots of choices to make. And by the way, list style type and all of the properties we'll look at can apply to unordered lists as well. We're just looking at this first with the ordered list. So I'm going to go ahead and choose something here that will make this look like an unordered list at first. So let's look at bullet. I believe it was bullet. Let me check the selection. And did I see bullet here? Not bullet, it's disk. There we go. I call it bullet points, but they're actually disks is what they're referred to. So this looks just like our unordered list now. So the only way we could tell that this is an ordered list is to actually look at the choice 1, 2, and 3. At 3, and when I save, now you can see we get the numbers 3, 4, and 5. And then we can also add a reversed attribute, and as you might guess, now it counts down 3, 2, 1 because it starts at 3. So if we started this at 5, now it would count down 5, 4, 3. It's also worth noting that if we are not using numbers over here, such as the Roman numerals or decimals, we still, it's just going to be the fourth. Consider that we could not have any kind of bullet or numeric out to the left, so let's just put none here and save. Some item, I'll put U as well. An issue that text to the middle, at least they have. I have to set the list style position to inside to get the bullet points to align with the text. But if we set them to the default outside, they stay out to the left. I'm going to scroll up for some more room as we look at this unordered list. And now decimal. That is worth noting as line each of the list items. Now a check mark image. It's check mark 3 again. And navigate the file path to the image. So we're going up into the images folder. Those bullets have now got changed to these green circles to copy down quickly, and you'll see how it for the bullet points, but then the fallback in case the image would not load. And so now when I save, we've once again got the image, and then finally we can provide the position. And so I'll say inside, and now the images are over with the text of each list item. So this is called shorthand. We just say list style, and we can provide style tiles, all list, and then child. And notice it only changed the second list item in the unordered list to red. So we were more specific, and we just changed one list item. Likewise, our nth child pseudo class also accepts the words odd. So if we pass in odd, now the odd numbered list items are red, and likewise we could pass in even and do the same. So now we're back to, so you could update the visual. I want to move on from the pseudo class of nth child to a pseudo element, which we have not CSS2. Let's move on to CSS display types. You can see I have Visual Studio Code here on the left, and I have an HTML file. And in the HTML file, I have a body element, a main element then that is surrounding the other elements. And inside this main element, I have 2 paragraphs. And in the second paragraph, I'm using a span element, and that span element has a class on it of opposite around the word another. You can also see I've commented out a nav element that contains an unordered list that we will get to later. I've also got a basic CSS style sheet here, and inside this I'm pulling in a font from Google Fonts as we learned in the typography lesson, and I've applied a basic font size and font family then to the body element here in the CSS. So that's what we see over here on the right in Chrome, and I'm using the live server extension, so you'll see our changes automatically over here in the browser as soon as we save our CSS. Now, the display property in CSS relates back to something we learned in the beginning HTML course, and that is about block level elements versus inline level elements. Now, the paragraphs that you saw we've included in the HTML are block level elements, and they have some default properties. So let's look at those. Let's do a light extend. Also got, this is an element, so let's, there's some elements of opposite, and we changed the color for the back elements, and each one is taking up 100% width of what they are given right now. Let's go back to the CSS and apply some styles here. So I'm going to select these styles, the paragraph and the opposite class, and go ahead and delete those and save once again so we can start fresh. And now let's apply something to the unordered list first. It's a possibility. Let's move on to CSS floats. You can see I've got Visual Studio Code open. I have an empty frame for a page. We have absolutely nothing in the body of the page. And then the style page, the CSS, has an import of our Roboto font from Google Fonts, and we've only set styles on the body so far. We've set the font size to 1.5 rem, and we're using the Roboto font family. So quickly, if I pull VS Code over to the left, you can see our page is completely blank. I'll let VS Code take up the full size of the page again, and let's start by creating some elements in the body of the HTML that we can style. So I'm going to start off with the div and give it a class of block. After that, we can just put in the word float for now because we will apply a float to it. And then we're going to create some paragraphs. So I'll use an Emmet abbreviation here and type P for paragraph and then say times 5, then the greater than symbol, lorem and 20, which means each paragraph will be lorem ipsum, which is just generic verbiage we can put on a page for generic text content, and each paragraph will have 20 words. So when I press tab, it should create 5 paragraphs, and there we can save. Now let's go back and look at our page and see what we have so far. You can see our div has the word float in it, and there's nothing remarkable about that div. And then we see 5 different paragraphs here on our page. So that's a good start to having some content. For example, let's go and ask that 30 also couldn't be the square. A square that is 30 viewport width units wide, and it also has the, and apply a color float. Now let's give it some padding, maybe 1 rem of padding, and there we have just a little bit of padding that pulls the word float out of the corner. But now our div of each other here, it will wrap would class. This will apply the style float, and we'll say left. And when we save, we don't get a change yet because we haven't applied it to our HTML. So let's go ahead and apply this second class to our div and now save. And we can see the text has wrapped up around the div. So now it's more like you're used to seeing, right? And is your first insert paragraph for the paragraph, and say I applied 10 pixels. Look what happens. It still is flush here. You see it moved 10 pixels over here. This float is not inside the normal flow, so the margin is applied from the left over here and not where we would expect it to be at the left edge of our text. And we can see that even more so if I do something greater, like say 20%. And now, yes, it moved this way over, but it didn't move the text here at all. So we can't really apply some to, let's do, so we would have a margin on the right side of, let's say 1 rem. We should be able to see that. And now that makes the difference that we wanted right here. I'm going to hide it down, and I'm also going to create a right class. I need to select that correctly. There we go. It's a right class, so instead of float left, it will be float right. but then instead of margin right, let's put a margin left on it. And I'll save, but we don't have it applied once again to any div. So we need to come back into our code, and let's say after we've gone down 3 paragraphs, we want to have one more. So we'll say div.block.write, and that should apply those classes, and it did. So now we can save, and we have another div, and it's floated right. And of course, a little different. Again, I would say in more legacy code, let's call this a clear class, and then inside of this class we'll say clear, and we can say just right or just left if you want to clear something that is specifically floated left or right, but it's very easy to just say both, and then it will clear both. And you'll see what this does in just a moment here. So what I need to do is come back, and then after the first paragraph, if I wanted to clear that, the old way would be to apply another div to the page and give it this class of clear and just leave it empty, and we would save, and then you can see the second paragraph doesn't start until after this div, so it is cleared. But adding it in section to make it a little, so now we have a section, and inside the section, and we'll give this a color of bisque, which is kind of a neat color. And after bisque, let's go ahead and apply a border. So we'll say border 1 pixel solid, give it a flat black color, and a little bit of padding, 1 rem. Okay, and let's save and see what we get. Well, this looks okay right now. I don't see a problem, but what if we removed this div with the class of clear and save? Well, still no problem. Let me shorten up this paragraph by several words and then see what we get. And now when I save, I just had too long of a paragraph to actually highlight the problem before. But now when I save, we can see the problem. This float is once again not in the normal flow of the page. So the container is only expanding based on the text content. And when I had more text content, it looked okay, but you can really highlight the problem if you don't have enough text content to push the container down. So we can definitely see a problem that needs to be rectified, and that is because we don't want the container to just go halfway. We want it to go ahead and contain the full item, the full element that we have floated left or right. So we think, why not go ahead and put that div back in place that had clear? Well, let's try that and see what happens. I've got the clear div there now, and you can see it clears the paragraph, but it doesn't help the container. So let's once again remove that div. I'll just press Ctrl Z to undo those changes and Ctrl S to save. So now the paragraph is coming back up, and I will show 2 different ways to fix this. One past approach that you may see in code is to set the overflow to auto. But this is in more legacy code once again, but notice it does work, so I wanted to show that. Overflow auto is a possibility to go ahead and get the container element to extend all the way down and contain the full element that is floated either left or right. However, the correct current way, as noted by MDN, is to say display and then say flow-root. And if we save that, we once again have fixed the problem. So if I remove that, save, we have the problem. Consider also use font from the Google fonts, bottom times function, and first it did, and I wanted in so far. So now let's move on to the CSS. I'll click the file tree again. We're going to make column and save. And now let's go look at our code or our browser and look at the side of that. But and now it's not necessarily one page. Or let's go width should essentially 50 pixels. Pull VS Code back up, and there's shorthand for this, so we don't always have to type column-count and column-width. We can just say columns, and there we could specify 250 pixels, and it would be the same. So I'm going to comment these out and now save, and we shouldn't really see any changes in our page because that should mean the same thing, just in shorthand. We can also provide dividers. So this would be with the column-rule property, and here we can say we want 3 pixels, and I'll press Control B to hide the file tree so we can see all of this, but 3 pixels, let's say solid, and now let's just give some kind of color here. I'll just go with that flat black and save. And notice this column rule is just like when we provide a border, and the values go in the same order. So when I have provided a border in the past around any kind of element, you have seen the size and then the type of border and then the color. And that's the same for the column rule. Now let's see what it does to our page. And here we see the rules between each column now. And of course, they will disappear when the columns disappear if the sizing dictates that. And so once we get down to one column, even though we've said column rule should exist, it won't if there's only one column. But if there are columns to separate, that's when the column rules start to show up. And this will once again divide up to how many columns we've created. Also, and I'm next topic, just some kind of generic header here, and we can save that. Now we go back to the over here in the browser. Now first let's look at the HTML page that I have here on the left in Visual Studio Code, and you can see it's a basic layout, and I'm really using more divs than I'm normally comfortable with. All of these div elements, they are block elements, but they are not semantic. They do not provide any additional meaning to a page, and they don't really help accessibility at all. So in a typical project I wouldn't use a lot of divs, but they are good for today's example. So you can see we have an outer container, and this outer container in the browser is a dashed black border that outlines this container. And then we have an inner container, and it is a solid blue line here in the inner container. And then inside of this inner container, and you can't see them right now, we have 4 other divs. They all have the class of box, but then each has an individual class: absolute, relative, fixed, and sticky, and those are possible values for the position property, and we'll look at each of those. Let's jump over to the style.css file. You can see I'm importing in that Roboto font, as I have been in the last several tutorials for this CSS series. And then I guess I have the Lobster font here too, although I'm not using it right now. I've also got this CSS reset already in place with a margin of 0, padding of 0, and box sizing equal to border box For the body, we're using that Roboto font family, and then we also have a font size of 1.5 rems, and then a min height of 200 viewport units. So that means besides what you see here, we've got another full page that we can scroll down to, and we'll need that in just a little bit. Then we have the styles for the outer container already. Here you can see the dashed border, it's 3 pixels. We've got a width and a height set on it just for this example, and a top and bottom margin of 40 pixels. The auto for left and right centers the container, and then we'll see something very similar here for the inner container. Of course, the different styles, just sizing it a little differently, and the color and size of the border. And then we have the box class that applies to the 4 divs that you cannot currently see. You can't see them because their font color is white. Other than that, they are a box with 150 pixels width and height, and a little bit of padding in there. Okay, with all of that said, let's go ahead and style our first class, and that was the Absolute class. So what we'll do for it is set a background color that's different than the others so we can tell them apart a little better. Let's just set that to a blue. We'll use hexadecimal there. And then let's go ahead and set the position. But the first position value we're going to use is static, and that is the default of all elements. They're static just already when you put them on the page. So essentially it's not going to change anything. I just wanted you to see that value to know that's the default even if you don't set it. So now let's go ahead and set a position of absolute and see what we get when we save. It really didn't change anything, and that's because we didn't set any other value. When we set these values, we need to go ahead and set a top, left, right, or bottom. We don't have to set all of them, but it needs at least one to change where it's at. So let's set the top to 0, see what we get. It moved it all the way to the top of the browser. Now what if we set left to 0? Now it moved it all the way to the left, so it's in the upper left corner. So absolute positioning needs a relative parent. And if it doesn't have an ancestor element that is positioned relative, then it takes the initial boundary or the initial box, which is essentially the browser window. And so that's why it went up here to the top and then the left when we set that position. But now we can scroll up and we can set a position on this outer container. You see I'll set the position to relative. And now look what happens to our absolute box. It now has an ancestor that is positioned relative, so this positioning is no longer relative to the browser window. It's relative to this ancestor that has the position set to relative. But what if we set the position to relative on more than one ancestor? We'll do that here if I could spell relative again, and I'll save, and now you can see this is back where we started inside the inner container, and that is because it picks the ancestor that is closest to it. And so our box started inside of this inner container. So with the outer container set to relative and the inner container set to relative, it picks the closest one, the nearest one, and that is the inner container. So we're back here. Now, as you might have guessed, the zeros are essentially the default choices there. So if we save, we don't really see a change from position absolute with the top and left 0 to where they are now. Of course, if we change which ancestor it was relative to, we would see a change as it would move to whichever ancestor it was relative to. However, we can put in other values. So let's do something like 100 pixels, and it moved. So here we're going to say a top where you can use. Let's move on to CSS Flexbox fundamentals. We'll be learning the CSS properties that you'll use most frequently when working with Flexbox. You can see I've got Visual Studio Code here on the left, and it's in a smaller window today. I've got a larger browser window here on the right. And I'll quickly look at the HTML file as well that we're starting out with, and this will be available in the source code that you can download. But we've just got 6 divs right here, and all of them have a class box, and then they each have their own number, as we see on the page 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. Divs are block elements, and so they're spanning the full width of the container, and they're stacked on top of each other, and you can see we have a main element with the class container as well. Okay, back inside of our CSS file, we're starting out by bringing in the Roboto font from Google Fonts. We've got a very basic CSS reset here at the top. On the body, we're setting up that Roboto font. We've got a min height of 100 viewport units, so it's the full screen or the full browser window. And then we've got padding of 20 pixels, so you see it pushing down our main container from the top, that 20 pixels here. It's also on the left, right, and bottom. It's just harder to see that. And then we have some styles on the container. So it's got a max width of 800 pixels, a minimum height of 400 pixels, margin inline set to auto. So it is centered horizontally here, and we should have the same amount of space on the left and the right. We've also got a black border going around the main container, but you really can't see that right now because the contents are black as well. And then the boxes, they have a min width and min height of 100 pixels. And remember, the boxes are the 6 divs. It's got a background color of black, a color of white that we see on the numbers. Font size is 2 rems, so the numbers are a little bigger, and just a little bit of padding of 0.5 rem. And that's what we're starting out with for our code. But we're going to apply flex. And the area that we'll apply that to first is the container. We'll make our container a flex container. And as soon as we apply flex, I need to spell display properly, things will change on the page. So I will save. And now we see some big differences over here. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 going horizontally instead of vertically, and they're not stacked on top of each other. So the divs are a min width of 100 pixels, so they're about 100 pixels wide each, and then their height is filling out the full 400 pixels we have for min height on our container. You can now see the border over here on the right side of the container at least. But they are now considered to be flex items. And so they're starting out at the position flex start, and that's where they default to in this alignment. So they're just all over here to the left. So let's look at how we can align these horizontally first. We're going to do that with the justify content property, and the place they're starting is called flex start. So we'll say flex start. And yes, I'm already wrapping the code. I pressed Alt-Z in Visual Studio Code to do that. So we don't see any change. But what if we switch this to flex end and save? Well, now they're all over to the right instead of being all the way over to the left. Likewise, we can set this to flex center, and now they're all in the center. You know, let's go ahead and add another property here called gap. And we'll set this to 1 rem, and now look at what happens. We get a 1 rem gap between each flex item, so that helps us see each individual one just a little bit better. Now, continuing with the justify content, there's some other good values worth looking into. Center is often used, but there's also space around. And now look at that. Now, this isn't used as often, and maybe you can see why. We've got some space between each one. But look, the space at the edges before the end and beginning of the container aren't quite as big. And also, if we remove the gap now at this point, we should still see that space around evenly space everything out, except at the beginning and the end. So what if we did the other one that we saw space between? Well, now there's no space at the beginning and no space at the end, but it's evenly spaced between all of the flex items. And then there is a little newer value that is much better to use. I think it was probably requested, and that is space evenly. So not only between the items, but also at the beginning and the end, we have evenly spaced the items throughout the container. Okay, I'm going to change this min height on our boxes to a height of 100 pixels so we can clearly see each box and some space in a vertical way because now we're going to align the items vertically as well. So we use justify content for horizontal as things are currently set to a row, and that's why we use justify content for the horizontal. Now let's go ahead and align the items. So this would be the other axis, and that's going to be vertically. So if we align the items to flex start, they're where they are by default, right at the top. But likewise, we can say flex end, and now all of the items are at the bottom. As you might guess, we could say flex or align items center, and now they're centered vertically as well. Now we don't have the other options with align items like space around, space between, because if you think about it, it's only one item at a time when we're aligning the items. Horizontally here, we had 6 items in this row, but if we look vertically, we've just got 1 item for each alignment. So that's why we don't have the space options. Now we can change the direction as well. So let's look at flex direction, and by default, we're in a row. So we could say column. And now if we save, we've got all of our blocks stacked once again as a column. And remember, I removed that gap that we had, so there's no longer a space between them. And they're also taking up the full height of our container. Remember, our container has a min height of 400 pixels, but we've got at least 600 pixels worth of divs right here. So they're filling this up, so there's no extra space to space out as well. Now, if we go ahead and change something, let's change the align items, and we'll see if you think we're going to get what we get. I will save, and now everything's to the left because our align items became the horizontal alignment. Again, just 1 item at a time instead of all 6. All 6 are now on the vertical alignment. So by having flex end, they will all go to the right. And of course, we were back at center, and that put everything in the center. So if we change our justify content, we might not see much of a difference right now because we're taking up all that space. So if I said flex start, for example, it didn't really change. And that's because we're eating up all of the space of the container already. So there's no real change to notice when we have this set with 600 pixels inside of a container where we're taking up all of the space. But if we change this to row, now we'll see our center where they're all together, once again with no gap whatsoever. If we wanted a gap, we could put our gap property back in and say 1 rem, and now we have that 1 rem gap between each one of these, but they're centered. Now, of course, if we change this back to space evenly, we might not want that gap property at all. Now, since we have the flex direction property in here, there's more that we can do than just row or column. What about row reverse? And if I save, notice now 6 that was to the far right is now to the left. We reversed the order of the elements here. So row reverse is an option, and as you might guess, column reverse is also an option. Now let's look at one other property here. I can leave the row reversed for this for now, but what I need to do is drag this all the way over to take up the full screen and open up DevTools. And once we have DevTools here, we're going to notice something as I resize the window. The Flexbox row, our row of boxes, it's really not changing, it's outgrowing. It's not resizing or shrinking to stay inside of the container or the page. So that is considered an overflow. So there is a setting for that. Let me bring up Visual Studio Code again. And the setting that we could use is called flex-wrap. And so we would want to set that to wrap. And now if we save, and we have our DevTools still open in the window, you can see it wrapped into 2 rows. And we have it reversed. Now you might be surprised at this because 6 isn't at the top now, but our rows have reversed. So 3 is to the far left and 1 is to the right. 6 is to the far left of row 2 and 4 is to the right. Now we could change this back, of course, to row. See everything in the order that we would normally see it in, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And then there's also shorthand that we could use instead of flex direction and flex wrap. And that would just be called flex flow. So let me just select both of these, and now we'll have flex flow. And then the first is the direction, so we'll say row. The second value is wrap. And now by default, you noticed our row did not wrap. So the default value is no wrap, but we want it to wrap. So we'll set that. And now nothing should change about the page the way we had it. Let's see if I can resize just a little more here. And yep, we've got wrapping of the rows as it needs to. And it will even get down to just one column. And now we'll bring it back to 2 columns, or 3 rows is what we should consider that, since we have it set to rows. And there's again back to 2 rows, and still 2 rows with this width because we've just got 1 square that carries down. I'll bring it back to about even here. And now that we've got that, this is shorthand. So remember, the first is the flex direction, the second is the flex wrap with flex flow. Okay, there's one more property to consider on our container. Remember, we're putting all of these properties on the flex container right now that I've outlined here with our 1 pixel black border. I'm going to scroll just a little for some more room here. Underneath, let's put align content. Now this aligns the rows. So you can see by default, we have 2 rows and they're spaced out here. There's some room between them. Now this will take values just like justify content, but it's aligning the rows. So we'll put in flex start first, and if we save, notice both our rows move up to the top. Likewise, flex end, move them both to the bottom, and flex, or not flex, just center, has them both in the center. So that wasn't the default either. What about space between that we could also use on justify content? Yep, it puts 1 on the top, 1 on the bottom. Space around, so that's a little different as well. And then space evenly, that we might like, if I could spell evenly once again, and save. And yes, that changed the alignment just a little bit as well. Okay, now we're ready to move on to the individual flex items, because we can also set properties on the flex items instead of just the container, and that will also change how Flexbox handles the layout. So the first thing we can do is apply some of the things we learned from above. Let's go ahead and make each one of these flex items a flex container. Now once again, we will be applying properties as a flex item soon, but if we make these a flex container, then we could go ahead and display those numbers centered right in the middle of each box. So if we say display flex, justify content, center, and then align items, center, and save, now all of our numbers are in the middle of each box. And yes, as you might guess, you could use these 3 properties to center any element inside of a container, or you could center an element inside of the body, which would be considered a container, the body element of a page. So now you essentially know how to center something in the middle of the page if you want to. Okay, now we have a few properties to look at for flex items. Again, these 3 properties made each item a flex container of its own, but they are still flex items inside of the large divs there, the letter number, min, and content essentially want. Pixels again, just minimum width right now. Now that is okay. Essentially, if we save, you can see now we have going to use a nth dash child, and let's select the second element here, and let's override that flex grow and set it to 2. So now this second one should take up more than the first, but it's not going to be double, and I'll tell you why. Notice it did grow more than the first, but they both have a flex base. Flex is 1 that I now before set. So once they get to where they can't fit in that 1 setup, we're going to select the second grow and then change them both to shrink. So now we have flex shrink in place. I'm going to scroll back up to our container, and instead of wrap, I'm going to set no wrap. So now With the larger value here of shrink 2, our second box is set to shrink more than the first box, as far as I can. 250 pixels, and see if that fits inside the screen we have. Yep. So as number 2 has flex grow, app or base in the percent. See if that works out for us. That's about flex percent here is number 2 is going smaller than number 1. All for us. Here it's just 100 complete. I'm going to go back